The Group 3 sector for here in this part of the world represents something over 20% of our market share, not least helped this last year by the introduction of KWS Firefly. That compares nationally to a Group 3 market of just under 10%. So again, you can see the diversity between our regional pattern and what's going on across the national picture. Great thing with the Group 3s is that they must have that end user acceptance, which is increasingly difficult when you're trying to service both a UK and a near European export market. And with relatively few varieties now to choose from, that has never been more important. As I said earlier, the Group 3s represent something over 20% of our market share, but interestingly enough, we've only got two mainstream commercial varieties there here to demonstrate, plus a candidate. Looking at the varieties individually, firstly we've got KWS Basset, which has actually over the last 3 years become the benchmark Group 3 locally and has seen off really in those years varieties like Clare, Scouts, Zulu pretty much now in its twilight year, and a plethora of other Group 3 types that have just been hanging in there over the last several seasons. Basset's appeal really is that it's the end user draw that it has built up over time, and that's not just from a UK Group 3 domestic outlet, but also some of the close continental markets that we've established in this corner of the country, specifically into Belgian and Dutch milling outlets. So Basset really has, as I say, got its feet squarely under the table as far as that's concerned, and despite the fact that it doesn't show particularly well in trials, the treated and untreated performance always seems to be a little bit off par. In practice, the variety always seems to perform particularly well in this corner, especially on lighter land situations. Going back to some of the work, the comment that Chris made a moment ago in terms of seed rate and extays, again we've done that work with Basset and seen a 20% increase in seed rate, netting us around about a 12 to 14% improvement in yield, just to make up for what is a shy tillering variety. So we're going back to varieties like Scout that we very quickly learnt that if we up that seed rate by that extent, there was always a very useful economic response to that input. Basset's also performed well as a second wheat, perhaps more so on the heavier land, and to that extent has filled Zulu's shoes in that role. Then coming on to KWS Firefly, which again was a new entry into the commercial market in 2019. Attracted a lot of interest because of its very high yield in that Group 3 sector, and that advantage over existing Group 3s has been maintained both on the official data and some of the trial work that we've done locally over the last 2 years. The great thing with Firefly as well is that it's had a fairly instantaneous acceptance by both domestic and the continental buyers, and fairly regular references comparing it positively with Clare, which we all know was the benchmark Group 3 for many years. We can see some real potential in Firefly maintaining a good, important role within that Group 3 sector.
Thanks, Andrew. Basset we had in trial alongside its sister variety Barrel before the pair of them were commercialised, and it was in part the trials that we did then that made Andrew and his colleagues at Denne's decide to major on Basset rather than Barrel. One of the biggest impacts we saw with Basset was that although they were both rated similarly in terms of septoria resistance, it turned out that in actual fact Basset had a resistance of 5.4 and Barrel was 4.5, so a full point between the two of them. And in that first year it was very easy to see, in fact, that 1 point was fairly marked in terms of the ability of the variety to withstand the disease, and that was an important point for us. The one weakness that we did see with Basset was that it was a little bit susceptible to brown rust, and of course down in this corner of the world brown rust is a bit of an issue. Having said that, a good fungicide program has always kept the disease at bay, and a remark that I would make, having looked at the plots that we've got again this year and followed them through from early on, and that is that Basset, if anything, seems to be getting cleaner as time goes on, whereas other varieties are going in the opposite direction, because we are seeing in a year like this, which should be showing a fair amount of brown rust and is starting to in other varieties, that the Basset does look relatively clean in relation to some of the other varieties out there. If anybody watching this was with us last year, then they will remember that when we walked into the Firefly plots, that was a bit of a revelation in the third week of June, because the untreated had almost dissolved completely to brown rust. Now, not quite as bad this year, but brown rust is developing, and subsequently, again, through the same services, made the pronouncement on Zayat and its new races. It is believed that a new race of brown rust exists which affects Firefly. To that degree, it's a concern, but again, as we've seen with brown rust, a good fungicide program, particularly important ensuring that you get a decent T0 with brown rust activity on, tends to stop the disease almost at source. And whilst Firefly is a concern and needs careful management, it is probably the benchmark in terms of yield and quality with regards to the Group 3s. And of course it has a very high rating for Septoria, around a 7, and for a lot of the country Septoria will be a particular problem. And of course, we've said again in the introduction, with the loss of fungicides such as chlorothalonil and epoxiconazole, the need to manage varieties by their ratings for Septoria tolerance becomes more and more important.
Moving on now to Galactus, which is a candidate variety in the Group 3 sector, going from RAGT. Now, Galactus does actually look quite an interesting prospect, not only because, as I said earlier, we've got relatively few varieties to choose from in the Group 3 sector, but that it does bring with it quite a strong set of agronomics and a very decent set of disease scores. A 9 for brown rust, well, you know, we'll see on that going forward as it becomes a commercialised variety, but the other diseases in that sort of 6-7 bracket, which hopefully will see some long-term stability. But I think it's important, we'll see what Galactus does from this harvest and what end user feedback actually is, but it is important that we do look at varieties such as Galactus and 2 other candidate varieties, LG Illuminate and LG Astronomer, again in that candidate sector, to see that we are continuing to get good quality varieties from a grain quality, agronomic and disease point of view into the market. And I make these points really because we're seeing a steady decline even in a fairly loyal area for Group 3s, that is the southeast, but quite a steady decline in plantings of those varieties. Whereas the market for Group 3 wheats remains actually quite static, if not growing a little bit, particularly in terms of the export opportunity because of fewer and fewer soft wheats being grown on mainland continent. Now obviously there's a lot of factors around our ability to compete in the export market, trade deals, currencies, tariffs, blah blah blah, whatever it might be, but the fact remains there will be at the very least a static demand for Group 3 varieties, and so would encourage growers not to discount them out of hand just because at present the premiums are under pressure. I think it's also interesting to note premiums on quality varieties as a whole, that while we've got Zayat, Skyfall and Crusoe perceived as Group 1s, and Extase and Siskin in the Group 2 sector doing something for the millers are actually enjoying quite a healthy supply of reasonable quality hard milling wheats, and inevitably that will keep cap on premiums from varieties in that sector. And I think we only got to see a fairly modest improvement in Group 3 premiums to suddenly make those varieties in terms of gross margin stack up quite nicely against the Group 1s and 2s. Now this is a message that, you know, we keep trying to push, and we have done year on year. I think it's more important than ever to make sure that, both from the point of view of marketing flexibility and exposing yourself to the maximum number of varieties to give yourself some genetic diversity of the varieties in your portfolio, is something you should consider very strongly when making your variety selections.